Good afternoon, class. Welcome back. I'm going to make some comments here. I'll try to be brief, but I want to put some concluding remarks on our first week together here studying environmental history. And as you all know, we're looking at the big four, or four environmental historians whose various ways of approaching the task of telling environmental history is going to form sort of a foundation or a framework by which we evaluate a lot of the environmental history that we'll encounter in class together this quarter. So we have thus far this week talked about Bill Cronin. We started actually with Donald Worster, and then we spent a little time with Jared Diamond. Today we talked in class about Bill Cronin, and finally, to round things out, we'll be talking about Carolyn Merchant and her unique approach to looking at environmental history. And she is currently on faculty. She's a professor of environmental history at University of California, Berkeley. And you can see there she has a fairly significant resume or track record. She's widely published, and much of her work is sort of pretty core reading for environmental historians. And in fact, the optional textbook, she both edited our primary reader that we have in this class, and she also wrote the textbook for our course, which I have made optional this quarter, and some of you probably have it, but she has helped sort of establish the scope and sequencing of our studies together this quarter. So for Carolyn Merchant, she's very much interested in sort of how differences between people, over both time and space. So what are those categories that throughout human history have managed to matter as ways of differentiating and establishing differences between people? In the early 21st century, we live at a unique point in time where we're actually surprisingly undivided as people. That doesn't mean that we're a perfectly equal society, but we've come quite a long ways in terms of evaluating people closer to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideal of evaluating people on the content of their character as opposed to the color of their skin or the gender, I should say actually the sex of a person, which is a little bit different from gender. Gender is actually the cultural expression of differences between the male and female sex. And then also class differences that exist between people. Since environmental history requires us to travel back in time, we also have to realize that these periods in time that we travel to oftentimes featured very distinct differences that existed between people based on these really critical social categories of race, gender, and class. So Carolyn Merchant is going to add that as a sort of overlay onto the way in which we look at specifically the way the natural environment is treated. And at first that might seem a little bit puzzling or perplexing, but as we look at it more closely, I think you'll see ways in which this has borne itself out. Okay. So first off, race, and this was our SNAP assessment for today. Believe it or not, the process of settlement in the Americas is one that has played very heavily upon quote-unquote race. And the reason that I put this in air quotes is because really contemporary sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, historians are increasingly coming to the conclusion that this whole idea of race is a fiction, that really there is nothing distinctive about people who have different shades in the color of their skin, or people who may have slightly different features in their face or other parts of their body. That essentially race is something that's a historical construct. It's something that throughout time people have paid attention to it, and so many of us have come to accept it as something that is an inherent difference that separates some groups of people from others. Now, even though social science, modern social science, largely has dismissed this whole idea of race, it's something that we still pay attention to as historians because race has played a significant role. This quote-unquote category of race is, even if it's not recognized by contemporary social critics, it is in fact something that has been recognized by people throughout history. So if we go back in time and look at, say, the experiences of different people, and we could call them ethnic differences, right? So we have ethnicity is essentially different cultural expressions. So while there may be no racial distinction between a Sioux Indian of North Dakota and a German immigrant of southern Wisconsin, there are ethnic differences, quite possibly. There may be ways in which that Sioux Indian customs that they practice, languages that they speak, so on and so forth, that differentiate them from their counterpart who's a German immigrant in southern Wisconsin. So ethnicity is probably a useful term, and it does serve to distinguish a bit. But this idea of race going back in history, it's worth noting that in terms of the settlement of the Americas, we know that the Spanish, when they first arrived, they had certain cultural practices that they felt were superior. The Christian missionaries from Spain very much felt as though it was their duty to convert the natives of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and other parts further south, the Inca of Peru, the Maya people of eastern Mexico. They believed that the Native Americans represented an inferior race, and that the Spanish people not only could overtake them, but that they should overtake them, and that in the process of overtaking these Native Americans, they should help teach them the ways of the Europeans, which, according to the Spanish, were superior. So there's one way in which race had tremendous impacts upon the natural environment, because the ways in which the natives worked with the land were quite a bit different from those of the Europeans. And because the Europeans believed that they could essentially prevail with their superior practices over their less sophisticated, less evolved Native American counterparts, it stood to reason that the ways in which the natives interacted with the land, their modes of production, if you will, should fall by the wayside, and the modes of production of the Europeans should ultimately prevail. Other examples would be in the mid-19th century, so 1862, the passage of the Homestead Act. Curiously enough, this was when the U.S. government, under Abraham Lincoln, this was midway through the Civil War, passed legislation which essentially involved taking some of the lands that had been inhabited by native tribes of the American West and giving them away for free to willing European immigrants, Anglo-Europeans, who were willing to settle on the western plains of the United States. So there was a quote-unquote racial component to this. If you were a Native American, you didn't qualify for a parcel of land under the Homestead Act. Similarly, if you were an African American, you wouldn't have qualified either, because African Americans had yet to be emancipated and freed throughout most parts of the fledgling United States. So these are some examples, and we could find countless other examples throughout the settlement of the American West. Also, class is something that Carolyn Merchant pays attention to. Class, if you think about it, this essentially refers to the economic categories that certain people fit into. We have, the wealthy upper class or upper middle class, the wealthy elites. We have the middle class, working class. We have the poor, so on and so forth. Essentially what Merchant's arguing is that oftentimes the socioeconomic class that an individual belongs to has real consequences for the way they see the environment. You may have seen this, or perhaps even your family has communicated this in certain ways. In some subcultures, it's common to think of environmentalists as elitists, these people who are bird watchers or people who buy expensive hiking boots and climb to high mountains. For some people, they think, who could possibly afford to take 2 or 3 weeks off from work and go climb some remote, high, ice-covered peak? And there's an element of truth to that on some level. Also, we know that in some modes of production, in our industrial capitalist mode of production, this means sometimes that it's the working class people who work most closely with nature. Throughout time, people involved in the logging industry, people involved in mining, people involved in ranching and fishing. Sometimes these are some very working class people. They are the ones that interact most directly with the natural environment oftentimes, but at the same time they do so at the direction or the directive of more wealthy individuals who are corporation owners or managers, the people who tell them what to do, the bosses, if you will. And so Merchant likes to pay attention to the role that class plays because, if you think about it, and I have the question here, there's a certain, it's a hard thing to describe, but really if you step back and think of it from an economic standpoint, it's really an incredibly small number of people in our society, in our commercial society, who determine the rules and the way in which we operate and who direct the large majority of individuals to carry out their jobs and their role. Think about that. We have, industries that pollute air or pollute water, and most of us have been convinced that somehow that is something we should accept. We should step back and let the individuals who've determined that it's really important that Boise Cascade pollute the air between Walla Walla and the Tri-Cities, or we believe that mines should be able to have eroded toxic tailings be the result of our efforts to pursue various minerals that we derive from the land. And I don't say that necessarily with a critical mind, but it's worth pondering, how do we get to a point where a relative few can determine how natural resources are used, both to the benefit and also sometimes the consequence of clean air, clean water, so on and so forth. All right, in my closing comments, I want to talk a little bit about gender. Just briefly, as you know, a lot of our metaphors that we use to speak of nature, like Mother Nature or the Corn Mother, which we'll talk about next week when we're looking at the people of the Pueblo Southwest. There's a certain gendered characteristic to the way we refer to nature. But I want to close with this idea of reproduction. And for Carolyn Merchant, reproduction is a really interesting concept, and it exists on a few different levels. The first is biological. By and large, women determine or have a critical role in determining how many children they have. There's decisions that are made, and they're oftentimes very rational decisions. In certain societies that have certain, a mode of production, it would determine whether you want to have a large family or a small family. So the very decision of family planning is one way in which reproduction factors in and has consequences for the natural environment, right? The more people that live in an area, presumably the more pressure that places on the natural resources of that area. Also, reproduction refers to how we meet our daily needs, our daily requirements. For example, the reproduction of heat within your home. That's something that has to happen on a regular basis. The reproduction, our recurring need for food on our table to feed us and take us through. So that's another way in which Carolyn Merchant looks at that. How do societies organize themselves so that people can meet their daily requirements that need to be reproduced on a daily basis. And then finally, cultural reproduction, the norms that we all learn, how we learn to live by certain laws and certain expectations. In our class each day, you folks behave yourself well. You've learned that. That's part of a cultural reproduction that happens on a regular basis. And with that, I'll close. Have a great weekend. Bye.